when it comes to reciting and memorizing the books of the Bible, including the Old Testament. Ben and I realize that Haley and Kendall are way faster at this than us. My brain works in like categories, and so I'm like, oh yeah, the books of Kendall and Haley were like ripping them in like 14 seconds. It was insane. So I'm saying I'm not the best at it, but let's say it out loud together. So we have the Pentateuch, the law, the books of Moses. They are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That sounded pretty strong. Again, some of you have this on lock. Some of you, this may be fuzzy or brand new. The point of this is not merely an academic exercise. It's so that we can know the story of the Bible. The Bible is all about God revealed in Jesus Christ. This helps us with that. Okay, the books of history. So we got Genesis to Deuteronomy. Okay, what's the first book? Joshua, Judges, I'm showing it, Ruth, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. Okay, so we'll have it on the screen in a second, but the 12 movements, the 12 periods of history, that's roughly, right, Genesis through Nehemiah. Remember, Genesis through Nehemiah, and then you can tack on Esther, which is a little bit after Nehemiah. But Genesis to Esther is pretty much in chronological order, pretty much. Okay, now it jumps out, because now we got the books of poetry. Okay, what's the first one? We got Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. Okay, now we got 5 major prophets. They're really long. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel. Nice. Now time for the hard part. I always switch the Z's. Not hard again for Haley and Kendall. They were just like, okay, here we go. It starts with Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. Okay, a lot of you doing well. You can practice that at home with your friends, with your kids, with your spouse. Keep working on that. A lot of you doing really well. So the 12 movements, 3 of them are in Genesis. There are 3 P's. That's how my brain works. I just got to do alliteration or something like that. You have pre-flood. Okay, and then we have, guess what the next one is? Pre-flood, post-flood, very good. Then patriarchy or patriarchal, the families. Okay, what's after patriarchal? I mean, you have it in front of you. You guys can probably see. What we're going to talk about today, okay, bondage. And then we got wanderings. Okay, after the wanderings, you have the conquest. After the conquest, you get settled in. You have I'm skipping it. You have judges, the time of chaos. And then you have a united kingdom. And then the kingdom splits, and you have a divided kingdom. And then after the divided kingdom, you have only Judah, or Judah alone. The northern kingdom gets destroyed. Then you have exile or captivity, and then restoration. Again, that's largely Genesis to Nehemiah, roughly in chronological order. If you memorize this, we'll memorize this because it'll help you remember this is the story of Israel in the Old Testament. That's it. These 12 categories or movements. This is the story of the Old Testament. Okay, Exodus. If you read it, hopefully a lot of you did. It takes, 2.5 hours or so, roughly. You probably notice, and when you read Exodus, the first half, it's exciting. There's a lot going on. It's a narrative. If you've seen the old school 10 Commandments, it's like a 4-hour movie, or the new school, well, new-ish. It was made when I was born in the 90s. It was really good. The Prince of Egypt by DreamWorks. Really good movies I recommend. So you're like, oh yeah, this is exciting. I know the story. And then you hit Sinai and then make the covenant and kind of the brake slam from a narrative point of view. And then it gets really detailed about the tabernacle, which hopefully is familiar with some of you as I've been preaching through Leviticus. Leviticus will be next week. Ben will be out here overviewing that. Hopefully it's somewhat fresh in your brain for next week's discussion. A lot of Leviticus next Sunday. Ben's going to do it out here. And then Sunday night, we're going to do a Q&R, question and response of Leviticus this coming Sunday night. So we can everyone together can ask questions and get the main point, the main theological point of Leviticus after preaching through it for a while. But the second half of Exodus is all about building the tabernacle. It really slams the brakes from a narrative perspective. So this is one of the printouts on the back. Hopefully you can grab it now or later. You already got it. But if you can tell, Genesis, Exodus, kind of really, really important to know the rest of the Bible. You need to know Genesis and Exodus. Genesis tells us, and Exodus, about what kind of God is the true God. We know he's a creator. We know he makes covenants. We've been introduced to him with Genesis. There's some key promises in Genesis that Israel, Abraham's family, would bless all the nations. Okay, you'll notice between the patriarchal age and the law of Moses, you have Mount Horeb. What's another name for Horeb? Mount Sinai. Good job, Jeannie. So this is where a covenant's going to be made in Exodus 24. Really important. Exodus reveals a lot about the nature and character of God and a lot of themes. Genesis, especially 1 through 11, and then the theme of the Exodus, you will see those themes repeated over and over and over in the Old and the New Testament. If you want to pick up these themes and whatnot, you should be familiar with the big picture ideas about God and the story of Israel in Genesis and Exodus. Okay, so the stuff that you could spend literally forever from a scholarly point of view, we just need a couple minutes to get the basics from the Bible itself as to what is the background, what's the context to the author, kind of the who, what, where, when, and why type of questions that are valuable for anywhere in any book in the Bible. Okay, the author's kind of a give me, but how do we know about said author? Okay, the author, assumably, according to tradition, is Moses. How about according to the Bible? Does that coincide with that tradition? What would you guys say about feeling comfortable stating that, oh yeah, this book, Exodus, and Genesis all the way through Deuteronomy, was written by Moses? What do you guys say about that? Real quick, one person wants to go for it. Todd?
Romans 10:5, the New Testament just, mentions Moses as the author. It's kind of internal evidence.
Yeah, there's a handful of New Testament passages, the apostles, Jesus Christ himself, who attribute these books, including Exodus, to Moses. Okay, if you believe Jesus rose from the dead, you're going to believe what he believes. It's just really as simple as that, even though you can go on an eternal scholarly route. Talk to Jaden about some of that stuff. But ultimately, the author is Moses. Some Christians think, it's solely Moses. Some Christians see later down the line, whether it's Joshua or even post-exile, some people made some additions to make the story neat. Whatever happened that's in your Bible, it's from God's Holy Spirit. Moses is the author. Jesus himself says that, like in Mark 12:26, where he cites Exodus 3:6 to speak of God not being the God of the dead, but the living. He says Moses did that. So Jesus himself, the New Testament would say Moses. Okay, we don't have to give a date as much as the date and the occasion go hand in hand. Where are we in Exodus? Whether you could think of this in two ways. You could think of the story that's written itself, or you could also think of the book that was written. Those two are really close together. What's the occasion and setting for the book of Exodus? Someone else, go for it. Yeah, Josh?
It's like the period of wanderings, and it kind of makes sense that this book would have been written maybe during the 40 years that they were wandering, because all the events
that seems place. Quite reasonable. So you got 40 years to write a book. Seems like enough time when you're out there. So the events of the Exodus, you could go from 1446 to 1225 BC. Again, you could nerd out and all that kind of stuff. The easiest is just reading 1 Kings 6:1, though there are some pretty good archaeological and numerological arguments for a later date. At the end of the day, it happened. But the point is, the context, or the setting, is we're the wilderness, right? We come to Exodus 19 and 20. Moses brings the 10 Commandments from Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb, right? This is where we are, escaping out of Egypt. So the occasion is Israel being redeemed out of slavery. We're going to talk about that, out of Egypt. And they're being prepared. They're being prepared to do what? What are some things Israel's being prepared for? What's the occasion that Exodus is setting up for to launch the story? Yes, they're being prepared for God to dwell among them and building the tabernacle. And then further, as we get to, especially like into Deuteronomy and whatnot, especially Deuteronomy, they're eventually going to be prepared for conquest over the promised land of Canaan. That's all interconnected. So the events take place in Egypt, escaping slavery. The wilderness, largely of Arabia, is where we are in Exodus. Again, the book could have been written during that time, or maybe at the very end at Moab before Moses. Somewhere in those 40 years, somewhere in there, Moses wrote or was writing down these events. I think that's safe to say, okay? That's what we want you to spend the least amount of time on for every book, not just Exodus. Not that it's not important. It's quite important to understand the occasion and the audience and the author. You want to understand the author's intent. They're inspired by God, but the author has their own intention of what they want to bring out. But we just want you to spend just a few minutes on that to set up the rest. Okay, now, how would you like to remember the theme, the main point? We could say plural themes. I went that route with one slide. Give a description. Maybe if you were to, let's start off with just like a sentence, and then we can go into themes. If you were to give just like a sentence, maybe I'll forgive you 2 sentences, because it can be hard. But if you give a sentence or 2 about, here's the big idea of Exodus. It could sound pithy. It could just be kind of a rote summary, but how do you guys want to remember the main point and theme of Exodus? It's kind of in the name, but we'll talk about more. But if you were to give a sentence that helps you remember the main idea of Exodus, what would that be? Or what is it if you already did it? Because the point with these sheets, by the way, even if you do them on Sunday morning, you get them done, who cares when you do it, is you can write these out and come prepared to these classes. If you fell behind, you can cheat off of everyone else and catch up and write it here in the pew. Okay, well, how would you sum up Exodus in a sentence? There's many ways. I'm not looking for one specific way, and I'm not going to nail you for it being super different. Jeannie had, okay, you're going over there. Jeannie will go later. Cheryl, and then Jeannie had an idea too.
A new nation being intensively trained, under intensive training.
Oh, I like that. A new nation being intensively trained. Discipled, right? The Israelites being trained and discipled by God. Jeannie had a way, John, of how she'd like to remember the book of Exodus.
God's presence, his providence, his provisions for a nation called Israel.
Oh, I like that.
And his law for his social law and religious law for them.
Mm-hmm. Very good. So I like the P's. Again, alliteration helps me remember. A lot of preparation. I'll hear that word coming up. Okay, how else would you summarize or want to remember Exodus? I mean, a sentence. Maria?
It'll be the Exodus out of Egypt.
Very good.
And the crossing of the Red Sea.
Okay, the Exodus out of Egypt. It's in the name, right? Exodus. It's kind of self-explanatory, but does anyone know what Exodus means literally or roughly? Yeah. So anytime you see like, you can get Greek and a Latin, and of course English is a Latin-based language. Every time you see EX at X, that's going to be to draw out or to come out, something like that. Right? So it's, right, you see this drawing out, you're coming out of something. Okay, how else would you want to remember the theme of Exodus? A description of it. Josh?
God will take care of his people even when they sin.
Ooh, yes. We could do that for a lot of books of the Bible, but especially Exodus. Because Exodus, what's the big sin, if you will? There's plenty of sin in the book of Exodus, but from the Israelite standpoint of view, what's like the big no-no in the story of Exodus? What would you guys say that the big mistake in the book of Exodus is that the Israelites make? Idolatry with what specifically? I know what you're... Yes, the golden calf. Kathy, you have a way you want to remember
it's
Exodus?
complaining.
Paul talks about it. 1 Corinthians 10. Paul uses their whining in the wilderness. It is surprising. It's all about like, look how arrogant Pharaoh is. God judges Egyptians' gods. He's the most high God. Pharaoh's nothing. It's like, this is amazing. And then right away, everyone's like, I miss Egypt. And you're like, what is going on? We're no different. So let's be careful about us looking down on them. But yeah, the idolatry with the golden calf is a big moment. And God still, as Josh was pointing out, keeps his word. his covenant despite people's sins. It is very surprising. Okay, anything else you want to remember the themes of Exodus? Jeannie, another one?
That the description of the tabernacle they were to build is very detailed.
It most certainly
it's
is.
amazingly detailed when you read it. You go, blind, trying to read it all. But the details in that compared to creation, which isn't too detailed, is the details, how detailed it is kind of is significant to me. I'm not sure why it's so detailed. Why is that passed on to us?
Yeah, there's something, it's so detailed. Ben was distracting me the last few days, texting me about, hey, what's the deal with using porpoise or dolphin skin for the tab? Did anyone notice that? Did anyone catch that if you read it? Could be a translation issue, or it was just a general leather. Maybe they got that said porpoise from crossing the Red Sea. Who knows? There's all sorts of random little things you find with the tabernacle. We're like, oh, I didn't know that was in there. That's really detailed. There's something to learn from that. Yeah, Todd?
Well, as far as small details, there's a quote I saw that no detail of man's worship to God is too small for God's concern. I think that was interesting.
Yeah, no, there's supposed to be careful with all the law in the tabernacle for sure. So you have, okay, let's go back to the sentence. I'm looking at the clock. How would you like to remember the theme of Exodus? Any other sentences or ideas? Benjamin?
One word, hope.
Okay, hope. Okay, you're very good, Ricky. Ben?
God delivers, establishes, and dwells with his people.
Ooh, very good. God delivers, establishes, dwells with his people. Wonderful. Very good. Yes?
Exodus 13:14.
Go ahead and read it.
And Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, what he will accomplish for you today."
Amen. Certainly, this is remember, salvation can, Mark's got a thought over here, John. To your right, sorry, over here. So we're seeing God's salvation, just like the David in the Psalms, right? Salvation has a physical reality, but it's pointing to something even more. But see God's salvation. Mark?
I like how God tells Moses in the Exodus 3:14, he says, "You need to tell Pharaoh that I am sent you."
Yes.
So the idea is that God is the self-existent one, God is the one that always has been and that always will be.
Yes, that's what this is. That I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. That's really so. Genesis does teach us about God. He's the creator. He's not from matter. He makes all things. He makes covenants. God is relational. We learn those things a lot about God in Genesis. But Exodus gets an even further unveiling. Moses further unveils to Israel and to all of us the very personal name of God and what that exactly means, and the very character and with that nature of God in Exodus. All this is wrapped up into the storyline. So a big theme that I think Josh was saying and someone else was saying certainly is God's faithfulness. So remember the promises. I know we're overviewing, but the promise to Abraham is a huge nation, a promised land, and this huge nation will bless all nations and families of the earth. Genesis 12, 15, 17, that continues with Isaac and Jacob. And even in Exodus, despite really bad circumstances like being enslaved by Pharaoh or committing idolatry, it was basically adultery on the wedding night with Yahweh, by worshiping the golden calf, God still keeps his promises. Huge theme. It's throughout all the Bible, no doubt about it. But Genesis and Exodus are like the foundation of these motifs and themes throughout the whole Bible, including the New Testament, like we will see in Jesus Christ. Someone already said this. It's Israel's origin story, really. If you look at Exodus chapter 19, this is after the Red Sea. You will probably recognize this because some of you will say, hey, isn't that somewhere in the New Testament? It is. It's in 1 Peter. But Exodus chapter 19, just look at verses 5 and 6. God says, "Now if you will carefully listen to me and keep my covenant, you will be my own possession out of all the peoples. Although the whole earth is mine, and you shall be my kingdom of priests and my holy nation." These are the words you are to say to the Israelites, God telling Moses, that great mediator. That could be another Exodus theme. There's a key mediator with Moses, the prophet. There's a lot of things in Exodus. Okay, Mark already read this in Exodus chapter 3, verse 14, about God's name and character. Moses is like, well, at the burning bush, Moses realizes, hold on, which God should I say was sent? There's many Egyptian gods and Canaanite gods, and God tells him, I am that I am. Tell them I am has sent me, or sent you to them. It's like, oh, so there's a statement of God's absolute being. This is really hard to overemphasize its importance. The name of God is in Genesis, Yahweh, or if you King James later, Jehovah, but they would have said something like Yahweh. Yah is like, is for God's name is like He is or He will be is the sense Yahweh. Every time a Jew would say that, they'd be thinking of God's absolute being. More philosophical, scientific term might be an uncaused cause, but that's what they would think. God's name is revealed. And I forget where it is. It's like in Exodus 6, 7, 8 in there. It talks about how even the patriarchs didn't even know God's name. Now, they say God's name in Genesis, but I think what that's getting at is they didn't understand the full concept, I think, perhaps, or meaning. Again, Moses is really important as one who reveals the nature and the character of God. Okay, Exodus 34, 6 and 7, you go back there. This is, again, just right after the golden calf scenario. You've probably heard me or Ben hopefully say, this is the John 3:16 of the Old Testament. There's a lot. Genesis and Exodus have so much in it that launches to the rest of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. So the Lord comes from a cloud in verse 5 of Exodus 34. He stands before Moses. Verse 6, the Lord, that is Yahweh, passed in front of Moses and proclaimed, Yahweh, Yahweh is a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and abounding in faithful love and truth, maintaining faithful love to 1,000 generations, forgiving iniquity, rebellion, and sin, but he will not leave the guilty unpunished, bringing the father's iniquity on the children and grandchildren to the third and fourth generation. That verse right there, Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7, is the most quoted verse within the Old Testament itself. By far. The Old Testament keeps going back to Exodus 34, 6, and 7. Even Jonah, who was a little prejudicial against the Assyrians, even though he was no better, when he goes to Nineveh, he's upset with God that God would forgive the Ninevites. And Jonah quotes, horribly in the wrong motives, Jonah quotes Exodus 34, 6, and 7, saying, dang it, God, I knew you'd forgive them. Because of this story. It's a really bad look on Jonah's part, of course. But more positively, like in the Psalms and the prophets, they will appeal to Exodus 34, 6, and 7 about why God will be faithful and save and redeem and keep his promises. This is why, again, many people, I like to call it the John 3:16 of the Old Testament. Everyone knows John 3:16, for God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him would not perish but have eternal life. This is the Old Testament version of that, if you will, in the sense of how well known it was amongst the Jewish people. It's quoted over and over again, over and over again. And that's tied with so that's God's character, which obviously is tied with his nature. God is these things in verses 6 and 7, 100% of the time, all the time. Unlike us, we're finicky. So you learn a lot of important stuff and detailed theology in the form of narrative about God's nature. He is who he is, no beginning, no end, and about his character. Perfectly loved, perfectly just, all those things are held within God. Okay, someone also mentioned a lot about covenant. Look in Exodus chapter 24. So this is right after the Ten Commandments. And Moses and the high priests and other priests that are going to be priests are getting set up, and they're mediating for the people. Okay, I would read verses 3 through 8, but let's go down to verse 8 of Exodus 24. So Moses sprinkles the covenant scroll in verse 7 with blood. Look at verse 7. The people respond, We will do and obey all that Yahweh's commanded. Verse 8, Moses took the blood and then splattered it on the people. This is the blood of the covenant that Yahweh has made with you concerning all these words. So this is signing the contract. This is the marriage ceremony, I do, between Israel and God. Okay, can you think of New Testament ramifications with this? A lot of you would be like, yes. Again, the overviews are hard, but hopefully in the overview, if you feel overwhelmed in Genesis and Exodus, that's okay for now, because you should recognize, oh my goodness, Genesis and Exodus, again, is setting up everything for the rest of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. It's setting up so much. So we have the idea of a covenant, a marital, a contract of sorts. That's given in blood. We'll hear a lot more next week that we'll talk about, again, in recapping Leviticus on Sunday morning and evening about what that entails. But the law, the covenant. Okay, and then with that comes the tabernacle. Okay, look in Exodus chapter 25 now, and look at verse 8. I've said this a few times over. It's been several months of preaching once a month in Leviticus, so I don't expect people to remember. But Exodus 25:8 is a good verse that launches into understanding Leviticus. But verse 8, they, the Israelites, are to make a sanctuary for me, this is God speaking, so that I may dwell or rest among them. But you must make it according to all that I show you, the pattern of the tabernacle as well as the pattern of all its furnishings. Okay, so that's a big idea of Exodus, is building God's house. And the Exodus way. As if these weren't enough themes and concepts, there's another big one in here. There's the theme of the Exodus, the way out, as we were talking about. It's a recurring theme, over and over again. You cross through water, you escape slavery, you move on out. Joshua, here comes the conquest. We're crossing water again, and where the way out is the way in. And then again, with the exile, there is a new exodus out of exile. When Cyrus says, you can go home and rebuild, you go back and do that. Even in individual stories. And throughout, like David and all individual kings and prophets, in their own little life, they will have an exodus where they wander and then they come back from said bondage or mistake. The New Testament wants you to see Jesus like a Moses, like a Joshua, and we'll talk about us being under bondage to sin, and that we are finding, the church is literally called the way, but you're coming the way out. Jesus is a new Moses, leading us out of slavery to this fallen, sinful world to eternal life. This theme is all over the Bible, Old and New Testament. There's a lot going on in this theme. Many themes, Moses being a mediator, blood and covenant, and God dwelling with his people, so much. But these are kind of key ones in my mind. God being faithful, the origin story, the name and character of God revealed, the law, the covenant, the tabernacle, and this pattern of the Exodus, constantly escaping bondage to a new creation, a new place that God has for his people. Get used to those themes, because they're over and over. Thank you, Ricky. I'm glad that's redundant. I hope it is redundant, and it needs drilled into our brains. Okay, think about this for yourselves. Let me know afterward. I'm looking at the clock. But is there anything you might change with the outline? I know it's very detailed. So you have this in front of you, which is good because the words are way too small on the screen. But you've noticed, right, you have the first half through chapter 18 is deliverance out of slavery, out of Egypt. The second half is worship. Can you think of a practical takeaway just from that outline? Okay, what was shouted out if you think about that? Deliverance from bondage, and then the second half is all about communion with God, worship of God. What's a practical takeaway about that? Okay, let you guys sit on that. Okay, so the first half, like we said, is narrative, with Israel being in Egypt under oppression. It's pretty crazy. I don't know how many people are in this room. I don't think quite 70, maybe 60. But remember, you have only a small family at the end of Genesis comes to Egypt to escape a famine. And that turns into a huge nation. They multiply in Exodus 1. There's a lot of Genesis 1, Exodus 1 comparisons, by the way. So Moses, does anyone remember what the name Moses means? Anyone remember that one? That's a fun one. Yeah, Jeannie's got, someone who's drawn out. He's drawn out of the Nile because Pharaoh Another theme you see, or another smaller idea you see in the New Testament, Pharaoh wants to kill all the Egyptian baby boys. He's scared of this immigrant population that has grown way too big in his country. So you have Moses, and God's judgment will happen with the people. Moses' life, remember, he kind of has 3 sections of 40. He's about 40 when he kills that Egyptian, and a struggle over him trying to save an Israelite from being beaten. We don't know the details. And then because of that, Pharaoh gets mad, and Moses is like, what have I done? And he wanders off into the wilderness. That's where he meets Zipporah, his wife. That's where he meets God at the burning bush. And Moses is like 80 when it's time to go back into Egypt. It's pretty crazy to think about. And he lives another 40 years after that when you get into the wandering of the wilderness. Pharaoh you have a showdown versus Yahweh versus Pharaoh. Who's really in charge? You guys have probably heard some of these things. This is something in the future for deeper study, but the big picture is that Yahweh is totally in charge and way grander than the Egyptian gods. Each plague is just like just kind of shoves it in their face that your God is not really in charge of all these things. Okay, Exodus chapter 12. As if there weren't enough important themes in the book of Exodus, what's the big deal about the Passover? Someone go for that. Someone sum up the Passover. You could sum it up in 5, 6, maybe a dozen different ways. Who wants to sum up the Passover idea and story in like 30 seconds? Ricky?
Direction, instruction on what to do to be saved.
Okay, yes, there's instruction on what to do to be saved. Hey, what are the elements of the Passover? Blood of what? A lamb, right? The firstborn dies unless the blood of the lamb is on that doorpost for the people. So you even see these themes where blood redeems people out of slavery. They go through water and are headed toward a promised land. Paul, again, talks about these ideas like in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. He says in Romans 15 these things, all things in the Old Testament written for our instruction. Josh, another idea on the Passover?
Also, God showing salvation of people even like before they're like cleansed of their sin, right? They're sinful people, but he's showing his kindness and love before.
Very good. Does God give the 10 Commandments and the tabernacle set up in the book of Leviticus before or after he saves the people? Obviously before. Now, if they're disobedient to putting on the blood, like they never be saved. But that is, that's not some sort of law-keeping method of like we really earned it. They just followed the directions. Salvation came first there. So Passover lamb and Jesus. What are some connections between the Passover lamb and Jesus? You could do book, chapter, verse, or just general ideas. Okay, anything. Passover lamb and Jesus. Jeannie?
The very word Passover is important. The ones that put the blood on the lintels, they were passed over for death. They didn't get death. And he passed over their sins in all of the Old Testament. He didn't, the Bible doesn't say anything about rolling them forward, which you hear sometimes, but he passed over their sins. And the Passover feast has to do with the Lord's Supper, that we remember Jesus.
Yes, very good. There's so much connected with Jesus. 1 Corinthians 5, I think it's verse 7, Paul says that Jesus is our Passover lamb in the new covenant. There's a lot to that. So once you get through chapter 12 and Pharaoh quits to get out of here, he chases him one more time through the Red Sea. God controls that as well. But this is, of course, the Red Sea deliverance where you have God in the cloud and the pillar of fire. That goes throughout all the wilderness. And the Egyptians are swallowed in the ocean. Okay, in the wilderness, right, this is the manna from heaven. Wow, another big theme that we're going to talk about for like 15 seconds, where Jesus will pick up on that and say, hey, I'm the bread of life. The manna came from your father. That's my father. I'm the real thing, though. Like, there's so much in here in Genesis and Exodus that's launching into the rest of the story. And that's where the people complain. They're like, we want meat. You see that in Numbers as well. They're like, man, we had better food when we were out in Egypt. And and all of those. There's a lot of whining and complaining as soon as they were saved. Okay, so all that's narrative. Once you hit pretty much to chapter 19, which we read, God said, I'll make you a kingdom of priests. You'll be my people. You keep the covenant. I'm your God. You're my people. Then it's very much so legislative, right? It's much law surrounding the tabernacle. So Israel comes to Sinai. You're still at Sinai. Hopefully, remember for next week, Leviticus is at Sinai. They're building all this right there. It's all to God's glory. I like the way this chart puts it. It's a law, the pattern of the tabernacle, the construction, even in the little details of that is, God gives 7 commandments and Moses obeys 7 times. It doesn't, you'd have to count them, but there's a lot of, right, the number 7 and completion and doing all of those things. That most famously from when we think of the law is Exodus chapter 20, the 10 commandments. Okay, what are the first 2 commandments of the 10 commandments? Someone lay it on me and then I have a point with that. Does anyone remember what? That's just close. Basically, that's the Shema, but basically it's that. But what are the first 2 of the 10 commandments? Mitchell's got it. Don't have any other gods before me. Yep. Okay, Mitchell said, no other gods, no idols. Okay, so that's rule number 1. So they're given a law. Exodus chapter 24 is a key passage in your Old Testament that we read in verse 8. They agree, blood of the covenant on the scroll, blood on us. We agree to keep the covenant. We're in this marriage with Yahweh. They agree. So that's why they're going to be held accountable for when they leave that. So we've talked about the tabernacle pattern in chapters 25 through 31, that God could rest and dwell with them. It's just like Genesis 1 and 2. Okay, and then the first 2 of those 10 commandments that Mitchell just quoted is what's broken in Genesis 32 through 34. No other gods? Well, here's this other God. They seem to call the golden calf Yahweh, and it's just like they're very confused. They're like, what's going on? And they make an idol. Okay, the first 2 commandments on basically, I don't know where I first heard this. I'm not trying to be crass about it. I'm trying to give us analogies. It's like cheating on your spouse on your wedding night. It's like we made this covenant, and then we're impatient with God's timing. Moses is doing who knows what on that mountain. Here we go. Let's build this. It's crazy. And Moses mediates. More themes you could think about on behalf of the people. And then the tabernacle is constructed in chapters 35 through 40. Hopefully you guys remember, and talk about Leviticus as we'll get to there next week. And if you look at Exodus chapter 40, go to the very end of Exodus. And then we'll have 5 minutes to hear from you guys. Verse 34, the cloud covered the tent of meeting, the tabernacle, and the glory of Yahweh filled the tabernacle. Moses was unable to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud rested on it and the glory of Yahweh filled the tabernacle. So God, there he is resting, and in his glory is in the tabernacle. So you could think about that with Jesus in the New Testament. But Moses can't go in. Okay, we'll talk more about this the next couple of weeks. Okay, so there's a lot in Exodus. But what are some permanent values, principles, messages, even on this side of the cross, that you see from the book of Exodus? Probably many you could think of. But applications that you find from Exodus, permanent values, living messages for us today. Todd?
We see in 1 Corinthians and in Romans that all these things were written for our instruction. As you alluded to, like you said, these are full of principles. The principle of obedience. Exodus 25:9, according to all that I show you, this is the pattern, you shall make it so. That's over and over again, and it continues in Deuteronomy and all that. And then the second thing, to me, is in chapter 36 of Exodus, where they're building the temple. Verse 5, then the people bring much more than enough for the service of work which the Lord, and he told them to stop. I love that attitude of just overflowing. I'm willing to do what God wants to do. That's a wonderful thing, and I think that's a message for all of us, But the principle of being obedient, we see that in 1 Peter chapter 4:11, 2 John 9. I mean, it's just all through the Bible, the principle of obedience and then blessing.
Yes, to be careful with the pattern. Careful obedience means you love God. Very good. Ricky? permanent
And-
value and message?
And as we go through, there's a common theme. If you start complaining about the setup like with this study, and we're going over that again, or we're going over that again, and you start complaining and thinking about that lesson follows through. Don't complain about something God is trying to tell you that you're going to see over and over again about His providence,
Yes.
His being. It never changes. It never changes. From Genesis to Revelation, it never changes.
Which is why we can trust Him.
He gives you instruction on how He wants you to worship Him, how to do it, when to do it, and all those non-negotiables, as you've said, over time in different lessons. There are non-negotiables throughout that God said, do it, and don't scat from it. Don't get away from it. And when you do, I'm not going to be happy with it.
Yes.
God.
And again, I want to bounce off what's being said with that, with the keeping of the law. God didn't make them keep the law in order to be saved out of Egypt. That is the response to living a holy life after God freely redeems them. All this obedience is wrapped up into loving God. Josh, a permanent value?
Just watching Moses' relationship with God kind of makes you think about, even if God were physically in my presence today, I would still sin and fall short of His expectations and His laws, but yet He would still love me.
Yes. I mean, and there's I was realizing this with our resurrection class, everyone has a lot of definition problems, but there's some sense in which God is literally with us, not some sense, God is with us today by the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. And yet we still sin, right? Which it's a different experience when we think of God talking to Moses face to face like a friend, but that is interesting. And yet God is still willing to forgive and hold that relationship. He's looking for a contrite heart. Was it Kathy or Todd who had Kathy, a permanent value from Exodus?
I just think it's a great book for putting our trust in God for generations. It just shows generations of trusting Him.
Yeah, that was one of the first themes I had of like God's, His loyal love, as some translations say, His faithfulness is really unique. That's why I should trust Him. He's kept His word throughout all these years and stories. Yes?
I think it's amazing. Chapter 24 is all about, it's like reflecting Jesus. And I just think it's wonderful the way they have a meal together and God's there. I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah, it sounds like the Lord's Supper.
Yeah, it sounds like the Lord's Supper, and then it says that they're all there, but He's not like saying, okay, now you have to do this, you have to do that, and it's like they have a pleasant time having supper and drink together.
Yes, God, we've been saying this with Leviticus. Lance has a thought. God is wanting to take us back to the blessed life, this Garden of Eden ideal that we keep messing up. Lance?
Yeah, I think a value in a message that even applies today is the mindset is, God, what have you done for me today? Rather than the message, God, thank you for blessing me. And mankind just has to get away from other gods and graven images, and that there's only one true living God. And will always, has been, is now, and will be in the future.
Okay, other permanent values and living messages. A lot of things. Jeannie?
Priest, Aaron and his sons, he gives them detailed instructions. And we are priests today. We could learn from instructions to Aaron and his sons, I think.
Yeah, the Aaron and his sons we talked. You see more instructions in Leviticus. Maria, you have a thought with that?
Yeah.
Sorry. Go ahead, Maria.
Learning the Bible when I was a kid up to now, but everything in the Bible has a learning mentality.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, and remember I know we're going somewhat back to basics, but these are, if you miss these basics, you miss the whole enchilada. Jesse?
I think it's good to remember that this is just part of the story, right, that points to Jesus. And when you look at the law of Moses, it's not really perfect either. Like when you look when Jesus comes and he talks about what to do with divorce, for example, he says, what God has joined together, let no man separate. And they said, why then did Moses command, one to give a certificate of divorce and send her away? And he said, because of the hardness of your heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. So there's this sense that the law isn't made perfect yet, and Jesus comes to really fully complete that story.
Yeah, he shows what its ideals were in the Old Covenant.
Yeah.
He sums it up with, hey, the intention of all these laws was to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself, not to look for loopholes of, can I divorce my wife for any reason or whatever.
Yeah.
They missed the intention. Very good. Okay, so next week is Leviticus. According to this chart here, Leviticus would take you just over 2 hours to read. This is, as I've joked before in the sermon series, is where yearly Bible readings go to die, because we go to Leviticus and we're the foreigners to Leviticus. Okay, we got to try and think to the best of our ability what we know from the Bible itself. Is what would an ancient Israelite think about these things? What are the conceptions? On the back table is all the Leviticus stuff. So you have the Leviticus handout and the Leviticus chart. They're on the, very appropriately so right now, 10 Commandments table in the back. And so you can grab those after class is over. Oh, this afternoon, quick last shout out. This afternoon, we're doing more evangelism encouragement this afternoon that Jesse's leading us. Is that 2:30? 2:30 in the fireplace room. All right, we'll talk about Leviticus next week. A lot. Ben's doing it in the morning. We're summarizing it in the evening. So I recommend you read Leviticus this week. Thank you, guys.